Hello, everyone, and welcome to How to Have Extraordinary Relationships. And I'm here with author, journalist, queenager. Just written a book called Much More to Come, which she's going to talk about today. It's Eleanor Mills. Thank you for coming, Eleanor. We've got a lot to talk about. Just to give you a sense of her book and what she's writing about and talking about is surviving midlife crisis, navigating the highs and lows of menopause, second careers, being a queenager, because Eleanor runs this wonderful online community called Noon, and she's going to talk more about that. So welcome, Eleanor. How are you today?
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's lovely to be here. I'm a long-term fan of Lucy. We're both recovering hacks. So we're both in our kind of queenager next chapter. There is life after journalism.
There is life after journalism. We're both still doing a bit of journalism, but that's, I think, slightly different now. So just tell us about you and what happened, because I know that you had a crisis that was sort of foisted on you, I imagine. I don't know how it feels now in retrospect.
Yeah, it's a really interesting one, isn't it? Kind of talking about big kind of life shifts that happen. And when I first started talking about having been made redundant, I found every time somebody introduced me as, this is Eleanor Mills, who was this big honcho on the Sunday Times, and then she got made redundant, I would literally feel like I was dying inside. But I've now become really used to it. So it just shows you can kind of get used to anything. So my story is in a nutshell is I was a big executive in the media, in the newspaper world for 23 years. I was chair of Women in Journalism. I was the editorial director of the Sunday Times, editor of the Sunday Times magazine. I was a kind of, I was a columnist. I was an interviewer. I was a kind of big honcho in the UK kind of newspaper scene for a quarter of my life, really. And I started that as soon as I left university. I'd kind of gone straight in, and I'd always been a bit of a kind of journalistic wunderkind. I was the youngest features editor they'd ever had on the Telegraph, and I was running all sorts of big bits of papers when I was in my 20s. And then so I had this wonderful ride, like jumping on a surfboard and kind of surfing it, and all around me people were falling off, and somehow I was still on it. And then I got to year 23, and they brought in a new editor, and I was suddenly out in a very, very sudden and dramatic way, which I really hadn't been expecting. I think when you've been a survivor for that long in that brutal an industry at that tougher kind of company, you kind of, maybe you get a bit too relaxed, or you kind of feel like the chop's not coming for you. But then I get this call one day saying, oh, will you pop up and see the new editor? And she'd been there for like 2 or 3 months. So I'd kind of assumed I was all right. There'd already been a wave of people who got whacked. And I walked up, and I had all my I was editing the Sunday Times magazine at that point. So I had all my kind of future plans and things. And I remember walking into the office and then looking around and suddenly thinking, oh, it was that meeting, the meeting where there's the boss and the head of HR and a box of tissues on the table. Ooh. And that there's basically no way back. I mean, you basically know that you're going to be terminated, and that the only thing you can do really then it's just about negotiation. It's about a kind of so what's the settlement going to be? And because you've been through that so many times kind of on the other side before, that that no one argues their way back from that moment of the tissues and the head of HR. But it's a question of what can you get out of there with. But it was a very, very weird moment for me, because it was like a really like kind of PTSD kind of reaction for me, a bit like if you're in a car crash or something, where there's a bit of your brain which kind of goes on being logical, but most of me had completely checked out. And I don't really remember very much about that meeting at all, except for thinking to myself, I will not cry, which I managed not to, and looking out of the window and watching birds kind of swooping around the top of Southwark Cathedral opposite, and this tugboat kind of chugging very slowly against the water, against the tide on the Thames. And there was a kind of conversation that went out, but to all intents and purposes, I was just not there. And I kind of knew in that moment that that was a death, that it was the death of this person that I had been, and that from that day on, everything was going to be very different. And it's really interesting. Since then, I've talked to so many women about, you know, the moment that they got divorced. I remember someone saying to me that they were going to go in and tell their husband and whatever that they were leaving, and that they were looking at the towel in the downstairs loo, and when they thought, when I next look at that towel, I will have done it. And just the kind of minutiae of those changes, how they actually unfold, what it feels like when you're actually in that moment of a huge shift, I think is really quite fascinating. But that was a real, that was that real moment of there's no going back. You know, there's the great Thornton Wilder thing about the bridge of San Luis Rey. There's a land of the living, the land of the dead. You know, the bridge is love, the only survival, the only meaning. But there's also that sense of there is a kind of finiteness, that there was this time, and now that time is in the past, and you can't reach it, and the only way is forward.
That's a really beautiful way of putting it. I remember a long time ago when my father was dying, and I had a call from his partner saying, "You need to come. I don't think he's going to last the night." And I was living in the country in the, near where I live now, actually. And I remember driving up the M4 thinking, I will never, you know, this is the last time I'll be driving up the M4 to his house where he will be alive.
Yeah.
It's
So that gave me a real shiver, and it's so
like
true, and it's
extraordinary
that,
sensation. I hadn't really thought that lots of other people had, but it's that kind of, from now on, everything will be different. I don't know how it's going to be different, but it's going to be different.
And I think in some ways that kind of realization, actually, it was quite helpful, because I just had such a strong sense that this was the end of something. And since, a lot of people have said to me, oh, why didn't you just take another job in journalism? You know, you could have got another gig. But I really knew on that day that I did not want to do that bit of my life, that being a kind of, you know, senior editorial kind of bod, going to conference, you know, swinging around in my big Game of Thrones cloak, I kind of knew that was over, and that I was going to move into a new phase. I didn't know quite what that phase would look like at that point, of course, and I was you know, then in the immediate aftermath, I did all the stuff you do when you grieve. I cried a lot. I sat in bed binge watching The Crown. I ate quite a lot of chocolate. I you know, hung out on the sofa with my kids. It was also COVID, so there was that weird sense of the whole world kind of stopping in the way that we had known it. So I think in some ways that was probably quite helpful, because my world had kind of completely stopped and gone crazy, but everybody else has kind of had too. And but I did feel very, very anxious about what I was going to be and who I was going to be and how this was going to work if I wasn't that person anymore. And I had, you know, those kind of anxieties about, I've always been the main breadwinner in my family, so I was worried about, you know, what we're going to do about money, and, you know, what is my life? Who am I without this enormous job that had defined me since my early 20s? You know, I'd been that person. So it was a real shock to be 49, looking down the barrel of 50, and to realize that I had a huge piece of reinvention to do. And I really felt like I died, or certainly like a big bit of me that had died, and that I was kind of on the scrap heap, that it was kind of all done. And I was very full of anxiety. I would go for walks on Hampstead Heath and stuff, and literally feel my heart kind of racing, and not be able to, you know, not be able to kind of regulate it or think about it. It was really horrible. I wasn't used to feeling like that at all.
And what helped you? Go home and you say to your husband, is that right?
Yeah.
You've been married a long, you know, you've married quite
nearly 30 years. So I had a very lovely, good husband.
You know, so that's a big, you know, you're married 30 years, you've got children, you go home and say to them, because it's shocking actually. You go in the morning, it's that thing I remember thinking this morning, you know, I always think about that this morning, you know, Michael Mosley went off for a walk, you know, it's that moment where you think, I went to work this morning and now I've come back and I've got to tell my family.
Actually, weirdly, the telling my husband and telling my family, my girls, was absolutely fine, because I know that they don't. Although I define myself very much through the job, that's not how they see me, you know. And I've always been very clear that the world is full of my mum always used to say to me that, oh, the world is full of, you know, indispensable CEOs, journalists, you know, she said the graveyards are full of absolutely indispensable editors, politicians, kind of, you know, journalists, whatever, and that the only people that we're truly indispensable to are our family. So I always kind of, and my family know that, they know me in a completely different way from being, you know, this lady at work. So actually to my kids and my husband and to my really good friends, I didn't mind telling them at all. I didn't feel shameful about it or humiliated, which is how I did in a kind of broader kind of professional context. But the person that I really didn't want to tell, and I write about this in the book, was my mother. And actually that was really, and if we're talking about relationships, and I think that one of the things about midlife, which is so important, is that it really catapults us back into any relationships from our kind of birth family or from our childhood that we haven't properly resolved. And it was very interesting to me that it was ringing my mum, which was the thing that I really dreaded. And it made me see how much kind of her ambition or her concentration on achievement kind of at all costs had kind of gone into all of our DNA. So to put that in context, my mum has 5 children, 4 of us went to Oxford. So that's a pretty kind of intensive drive. And she you know, she is very keen on achievement. And so when I finally rang her up, you know, probably 3 or 4 days after I'd actually been whacked, I rang her and I said, oh mum, I've, you know, been let go from the Sunday Times. And the first thing she said to me was, you'll miss the power and the, what she said, you'll miss the power and the influence, something like that. And it was actually, although it was a very brutal thing to say, in some ways for me it was very clarifying, because everyone else I told had been like, oh my god, poor you, are you okay, is everything right, you know? And my mum had said, you'll miss the power and the prestige. That was her her phrase. And actually what that made me realize was that was actually a huge projection. It was about, she was going to miss the power and the prestige of me being in that job. And really, I think what I've been kind of sloughing off and shedding and coming to terms with ever since was this huge kind of drive from my parents. And I had a very had quite a very privileged but quite difficult childhood, in that my parents divorced when I was 5, and they both remarried very quickly and had more kids and stuff. So really the only thing that we had, me and my brother and my sister, who were the 3 kids from the first marriage, the only thing that we really had which got us any kind of currency with our parents was achievement. And I think that we all brought back, you know, like dogs with bones, kind of, you know, here's another huge intellectual achievement, or another thing that we've done, and now I've got this amazing job, and now I'm editorial director of the Sunday Times, you know, whatever it was. And I think it was only kind of being spat off that conveyor belt that suddenly made me think, hang on, you know, who and what is all this achievement for? You know, is it even serving me? And it made me think, I don't think it had actually served me for a very long time. It's not really who I essentially am. And what Noon is all about, and what my book is about, much more to come, is about actually really finally becoming the person that we were always supposed to be at midlife. And I have a great friend called Aviva Wittenberg-Cox who talks about 4-quarter lives. So she talks about how in the 100-year life, well, I called it Noon because in the 100-year life, 50 is only halfway through. So I thought that was a good rebranding of where we were. But 4-quarter lives is thinking about, if we're going to live for 100 years, we have to think about the chunks of our lives in different ways, because it's not just get educated, work somewhere, retire, die, as it was when we had but 3 school years and 10. If we've got this extra bit of time, all of those bits of life are going to be slightly different. So she talks about 0 to 25 being about the years of kind of getting going, kind of, so you get educated, you get out there in the world. 25 to 50 are the years of achievement. It's when we tick all the boxes that everybody else has kind of set for us. In my family, that was very strongly about kind of an external achievement. But for other women, it can be about, you know, marrying the right husband, or getting a big house, or having the kids, or, you know, that all of us are programmed with a particular load of expectations, particularly women. And so why I think that this age of 50 to 75, what I see is the age of becoming, what I see as our queenager years when we come into our prime, is that what I see around me for so many women is this sense of having ticked everybody else's boxes, shifted into the shape that everybody else wanted us to be. And it's actually only at 50 that we can begin to kind of shake off those shackles and ask ourselves some questions around, who am I really? You know, who do I really want to be? If I can shift into any kind of shape, what is that shape? And for me, actually, that wasn't about being a powerful lady on a newspaper. I discovered when in the last 4 years, where I've actually allowed myself to kind of morph into the true shape of Eleanor, that I'm rather more kind of woo-woo than I thought I was. I'm a lot more spiritual. I run these circles for women. I call them our noon circles. So we have Queenager circles once a month now all over the UK, where the women come and they talk about their midlife pivot, their midlife transition, where they are at 50, 60, you know, up to 70, kind of what they want to do next, what this period of their life means to them, what they're shedding, what they're moving into. And I absolutely love that kind of circle holding. I find that completely fascinating. And I also moved into a place where I meditate every morning and I go and swim every day in the pond. And that's become that immersion in nature has become really, really important to me. And so I think I have become a very different person to the person that I was 4 years ago. And I love that sense of being able to shift into something new. I mean, you'll know more about this than me, but Jung said, right, that up until 40 we're just doing research, and Freud also thought that there was a huge amount of personal development and change and kind of becoming the essence of oneself at 50 and beyond. My stepfather was a psychoanalyst called Dr. Peter Hildebrand, who was the head of the adult department at the Tavistock Clinic, and he used to talk about the incredible work that he saw in patients and the incredible shifts and developments in them from 50 to kind of 80 or 90. He worked with people till they were really old. He wrote a book about probably about 40 years ago now called Beyond Midlife Crisis, which was talking about the kind of shifts that were possible in people. So I think it's actually really important that as we begin to live this longer, the 100-year life, that we realize that we're not set as who we are when in adulthood or even in kind of middle adulthood at 50, that work of changing and developing and becoming is the work kind of a lifetime, and that actually between 50 and 75 there's a huge amount of it to do.
So yes, I totally agree, because obviously I've been on a similar journey. I mean, there's all sorts of things to say about that, about for women, I think, and children. So if women have children, there's so much around that. Around maybe menopause or your children getting a bit older and empty nesting. So I meet a lot of, I'm sort of where you're at, which is, this is great actually. I mean, great time. Lots of women I meet, I'm 57, I'm 58 at the end of the year. Lots of women I meet do not feel the same way as me. They feel sad, they feel lonely, they feel remaindered, they feel empty nesting, they feel, let's say they're heterosexual, but they don't have to be, sexual partners aren't interested in them, they've got divorced, they haven't, it's a sort of dump of just awfulness. So can you talk a bit about that? You there to help people kind of help people that feel like that, and also you feel like that.
I mean, so I mean, I really don't feel like that. I think it's the first thing to say. And I also think that that's to do, and I write about this a lot in my book. So my book's called Much More to Come, The Mayhem and Magnificence, Lessons on the Mayhem and Magnificence of Midlife. And I really explore why it is that so many women get to their late 50s and have that whole kind of what I call the kind of clusterfuck of, bad stuff and kind of bad feelings about themselves. And I think it's very largely to do with the kind of prism, the kind of male lens through which women are encouraged to view themselves. This was something that I became interested in as a senior woman in the media and as chair of Women in Journalism, where we did a lot of research about how men and women are described very differently in newspapers and how women are taught to see themselves through a particularly kind of male lens prism. So give you a very clear example of what I'm talking about. I remember when Nicola Sturgeon went to meet Theresa May when it was just before Brexit up in Edinburgh, and they were the two most powerful politicians in the country. And the Daily Mail the next day talked about the discussions, and they said, forget about Brexit, it's all about Legxit. And they had a picture of Theresa May and Nicola Sturgeon sitting in this meeting, and it was all about who had the sexiest legs. Now that is classic male lens. So you take two of the most senior politicians in the country and you reduce them to sexual objects for men to look at and talk about how sexy their legs are. That is the male lens in action. So if you think about the male lens, patriarchy values women for being fecund, having children, and fanciable to men, i.e. a conquest of bride that they might like to have to kind of, add to their list of trophies. So for me, seeing women only and valuing women only for those attributes that the patriarchy values us for, i.e. fecundity and kind of hotness, is to see women in black and white when really we live our lives in colour as rainbows. So for me, I talk about in the book the kind of rainbow of all that women are. If we see women as a rainbow of all those colours of intelligence and competence and loving qualities and nurturing and culture and all the amazing things that we're capable of, and add in fecundity and fanciability are just two of those bits of the rainbow, then we stop judging ourselves or feeling so bad about getting older, because it's only the male lens, it's only patriarchy which thinks that women are only valuable when they're kind of hot and fertile. And if we can unpick that conditioning in ourselves and in the culture more broadly, which is what I try and do in the book, we can then see ourselves through a kind of a rosy rainbow coloured lens rather than just a kind of bifocal one. And therefore, I don't think we need to value ourselves for those same things. So really what my book is talking about and asking women to do is to value themselves in a different way, to understand how they've been made to feel bad about their cankles or their bingo wings, or being told that they have a sell by date and men are like silver foxes and age like fine wine, getting better with age, whereas women are seen to age in our culture like peaches, one wrinkle and we're done. We can start to challenge that narrative and say that's only true if you see that through a male lens, and actually there are all these other qualities we have which actually get better with age. So I talk about queenagers coming into their prime at 50. I feel more confident. I feel more intellectually kind of curious. I feel like I have a huge bank of experience of things that I've had a front row seat because of journalism, at the really on the front line of history. I can talk from really felt experience about lots of huge kind of topics, and so I really feel like I'm in my power. I've had 2 kids, I've had a marriage which has lasted covered 3 decades, I've been a successful woman. So what if I've got a slightly fat tummy and chubby thighs? That has not stopped me being successful in any way. So I think it's also about saying, how are we valuing ourselves? So to the women who are feeling like they're kind of done, washed up because the kids have left home and they're feeling like they're a bit wrinkly, that's because they're valuing themselves in the wrong way. And they've been taught to do that by a deeply male lens centric media. And that's really what my book tries to unpick, because I think if we can see ourselves in a new way, we don't need to feel like we're past it when we hit kind of 50 or 58. We can go on valuing ourselves in a much more true way. And really what my book's trying to do is to make that argument more broadly, that in the way that we've changed the cultural narrative around race and sexuality in the last 25 years, we can do the same for gendered ageism, which is where ageism meets sexism.
Yes, that's really important. I mean, the other thing I noticed when I'm doing couples counselling, or let's say older couples, so that the kids are sort of leaving home, and the women want to go and travel the world and do this and do that, and the men actually don't want to do that. They want to do pipe and slippers.
I think that that's really true, but that's also because of the lives that they've had up to that point. So at Noon, so if anyone listening to this is interested, it's noon.org.uk. And what we do there is we've done a series of research projects with some big management consultants. We did a first lot of research with Accenture. And what we saw there was that over half of the women agreed with the statement, up until this point, I've been looking after everybody else. It's now time for me to put my own interests first. You know, they really agree with the statement that this is now my time. It's when I finally get to do something for me. And so I think for a lot of the women, they've been putting everybody else's needs ahead of their own until they're 50. And they're absolutely not ready to kind of slow down or to kind of, you know, wind down their ambitions, or whether that's running around the world or setting up a business or doing the thing that they always wanted to do. Whereas for the men, they've been much, you know, a lot of them have had to be kind of, again, because the patriarchy have been kind of breadwinners, working really hard at the office, and they're absolutely longing to kind of, you know, have some time off and not to be on that trajectory. So I think that there is a real difference between men and women at this point. And we also see in the big pieces of research which are done by Saga and also by the AARP in America, that it's women who lead change at this point. So I hope that if we can make the women kind of feel better about themselves and feel that they're not done, that they can power up, that they can move into a new chapter, you know, as you've done, you've become a psychologist, I've set up a business, and I've written a best-selling book, and I'm, you know, run all sorts of things. Other people can do that too, that this is actually the decade when we come into our prime, where we can pull together all the knowledge and the experience that we've got, and we can do something new. And I think women have a real, I see it in the research, have a real hunger for that. And that's not something which is recognized or reflected back to us in the culture. That's why I set up Noon, because, you know, for years at the Sunday Times, I knew how hard it was to get older women into the paper, that we began to be well, I mean, there's a big as you know, there's a big kind of thread that runs through the media about women basically being used as an old picture editor said to me once, "Oh, love, brighten up the page." That meant putting a picture of a pretty girl, you know, that we're basically used as kind of eye candy within kind of newspapers, within media. Think about all adverts, etc. And actually, it becomes harder to run stories about women, older women, even though they're actually the ones who mostly buy newspapers. And there's a sense that a lot of the men didn't want to look at pictures of older women. And I used to have lots of arguments with that, you know, because there's that real thing of you can't be what you can't see. So if you don't see lots of amazing, cool older women being reflected back at you doing cool things, then you feel a bit dismissive of them. And it's really true that although women aged 40 to 60, what our research found is that women aged 45 to 70 are behind over 90% of all household consumer spending decisions, and yet appear in less than 9% of adverts. So there's a huge discrepancy there between the power of the Queenager pound and the lack of representation. And 60% of the women that we interviewed said that they felt invisible in the culture. And that is what also kind of plays into your women who come to you in therapy saying, I feel like I'm done, I'm washed up, I can't see myself, who am I, my identity is disappearing, my kids have left home, my husband doesn't fancy me. But that's also part of this bigger media story about what we tell women they're valuable for.
Yes. So you leave, I mean, you're asked to leave your job. Are you frog marched out, or were you allowed to go and say goodbye?
I wasn't frog marched out. I was quite shocked after the initial kind of meeting where it happened, and I went back to my desk and I got my bag and I just went home. I was just like, right, I need to absorb this. But then, you know, nothing in media stays secret very long. So I had a call later that night going, it's going to break in private eye tomorrow. And I said, I really want to tell my team myself. So I went back into the office and I told my team the next day that I was leaving, and thanked them all. And we had rather a kind of teary farewell, because I had a really lovely team of people on the magazine who I'd really kind of put together over the years. And then that was it. And then I left the building, and I were, you know, pretty well, I hadn't really gone back until, weirdly, my publisher is HarperCollins, which is also owned by News Corp in the same building. And when I went back a few weeks ago, and I was interviewed on the 17th floor of News UK, which is this huge kind of grand glass kind of atrium right at the top, by Decca Aitkenhead, who weirdly I'd hired to be the Sunday Times' chief interviewer. So she interviewed me kind of with great pomp upstairs. And when I went back into the building, my book, Much More to Come, had been animated and was on the huge screen as I walked in, which was a really lovely touch. And I went down to see Rebecca Brooks, the CEO. She called me down for a cup of tea later on after my talk, and she said she wanted me to kind of feel like I was being given a hug when I came back into the building. And so they've really rolled out the red carpet for me. And actually, I was on the Times bestseller list last weekend with the book. So I kind of feel I've kind of come full circle from having been like, you know, drummed out and now back on their bestseller list and kind of being fated in the building. So if someone had said that to me, that was what was going to happen on the day where I left there in floods of tears thinking that I was dead, I would never have believed it. But it did. It was a very sweet moment of kind of life coming really kind of round full circle. So to anyone who's having a really, really shit time at the moment, I would just say hang in there. You know, keep trying. And my dad always used to say living well is the best revenge. You know, let them stew in their own juice, do your own thing, and it will all come good again.
Yes, because you didn't know that then. I mean, you're a powerful person, and what's I think wonderful about this is obviously that, you know, the world encompasses lots of different sorts of people. You know, you are, you know, from a high achieving background with a mother who says you're going to miss the power. So you come up with Noon, you know, and it's amazing what you've achieved. It takes a certain type of person to go, well, I think I'll go do that then and do it. You know, you're a sort of starter finisher. I think, well, I want to do this. I'll do it. I don't go, I can't do, you know, but we're all made differently. So I can't, you know, there's lots of things I can't do. But, you know, so what happened for you with Noon? Where did that come from?
Well, you're going to laugh at this, but my actual initial idea for Noon came when I was on a magic mushroom retreat in Jamaica. And I can say that legally. You did ask. So I went to Decca Aikenhead, my pal, who amazing interviewer, best interviewer in the world, I think. She drowned about 10 years ago, and she had PTSD because he drowned in front of her and the children. And she came to me when I was editing the magazine, and she said, I've been reading Michael Pollan's book. It's a brilliant book called How to Change Your Mind, all about the effect of psychedelics. And there's a lot of research now about how taking psilocybin, magic mushrooms, can be good for post-traumatic stress disorder and for very intractable depression. And for anything which is very ruminative, which kind of basically is about kind of deep grooves in the mind and not being able to kind of get out of particular patterns. So things like anorexia or addiction, that kind of thing. I think it's quite helpful. Dec said to me, I'd really like to go and try taking magic mushrooms to help me with this PTSD. She said, I can't. She said, I can't feel it. I don't feel terrible, but I don't feel good either. I kind of can't feel anything. I feel numb. And it was one of those moments where she said this to me, and I just had this kind of, I would now say it was my awakened self saying, you must go and do this thing. But I just had this really weird sense that I had to go with her, that if she was going to go to Jamaica, I was going to go too. And so I said to her, okay, you can do it. And I'll try, and I think it's a brilliant story. We'll run it in the magazine, but I'm coming with you. And we justified it to the top brass by going, well, some of the other people on the retreat might not want to be written about, so I would be her kind of, you know, subject. And I also felt that I had a kind of duty of care. You can imagine the health and safety bits of the Sunday Times were not delighted about the idea of us both going off to take magic mushrooms. And I did think we were going to be like, might be brought back in a kind of padded kind of container or something if we both lost our marbles. So I was quite frightened about going. I've never, you know, I'd taken E and stuff in my early 20s, like we all did, because it was the rave generation. But I'd never been into taking psychedelics. I was never into that. So we went off to Jamaica, and on the very last day, I had this vision of. Well, I felt that I had the real kind of ego dissolution. So this is not microdosing. This is like what they call a noble dose, which is like a transformational dose where they want you to ego dissolution. So I took 8 grams of psilocybin, and I had this sense that I had completely dissolved, and I had become instead part of. I felt like I was just dissolving into a bowl of golden cream, that I had just kind of dissolved into the golden essence of the universe, and I was being recharged with all this golden light. I really did. Wow. And I lay under this tree for probably what was about, you know, an hour, listening to Bob Marley's One Love on repeat. Everyone else around must be going crazy. But anyway, I just had this total sense of being part of everything being connected, and of golden light kind of pulsing through me and everything around me. And in that moment, when I came out of that, I was lying in a swimming pool, kind of just going up and down with my breath, just it's such a magical garden. And I had the sense then that transformation really was possible, and I'd seen such transformation in this group of middle-aged people who'd been there doing the mushroom retreat. They were actually, interestingly, older men. But I just had this real sense that I wanted to bring this sense of transformation in midlife, of people's kind of hearts opening, and a kind of sense of newness and possibility to other people. And that was really when the idea for Noon was born. Not that we do magic mushroom retreats, we don't, but I wanted to bring that sense of the possibility of a shift in midlife to other people.
But isn't that beautiful? It's like you get this download somehow, and you kind of know that's what I've got to be doing.
It was so weird because, I'm like you, I was a cynical hack for 25 years.
I don't think I've ever been that cynical, actually. I don't think I'm very cynical. Well,
I was quite cynical because I had to, I was in charge of news coverage and kind of, making decisions about things and making sure facts were right. So and I had this very Enlightenment education, St Paul's, Westminster, Oxford, which was all about, cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am, the logic of stuff. How do I work it out? I really prided myself on my brain. So for me to really have this sense of a connection with something much bigger than myself, and to really encounter lots of different ways of knowing, which my former self would have been very resistant to, that's been the real kind of shift for me, and really getting a sense of kind of, energy kind of moving in the world, and the synchronicity kind of in the universe, and I go and swim in the pond every day, and I see the heron and I see the kingfishers, and I'm very attuned to the kind of nature around me. And that's very, very different from how I was. And that, I think, has been absolutely key to the shift that has happened for me, but also the one that I try and bring to my women. So for me, the act of swimming in the pond every day, it feels almost kind of religious, to kind of go and be in nature and be in that kind of, I try not to think about anything, just completely be there.
Yeah.
And I try and do that for the women who come to the Noon Circles. We do a lot of getting into cold water or ice baths or meditation, or just things to kind of jolt them out of their normal way of thinking about the world into something different, to bring about that kind of change.
So when you came home and said, I was blind and now I can see, I saw on the road to Damascus. How did people react to you? Were they like, what's happened to Eleanor Mills? I mean, how did they, I get that, because I think journalism, I think being a journalist is a wonderful gift and a wonderful thing, because you're surrounded by interesting people who are curious. Yeah. And I think the curiosity, and I bang on a lot about that, and therapy is I thought everyone was curious about life, and then I found out lots of people aren't. But I think it's really important to continue a sense of curiosity. But you come back, you've had, all this has happened. How did people react to you?
Well, it was me and Decca. So I think it was the fact that we'd kind of done it together. I think maybe they couldn't think that we'd both gone crazy. And we were definitely quite messianic. I remember going for kind of, a dinner with a few other kind of hacks, and them looking at us and slightly askance. But I think that we were very kind of glowing and excited about it. And I think that something really did shift in me, because that was actually, that happened before I was made redundant by the Sunday Times, but it was almost like I'd already seen what I was going to do next. So it was awful in the aftermath. I mean, being made redundant and having to deal with this kind of the fact that my achievement wave, as it were, had crashed. But I think that what kept me going, what allowed me to kind of set up Noom, to feel positive about what was to come, was that sense of the kind of goldenness of connection, and that I had been shown that there was another way forward. It kind of held the hope for me. And what I did when I came back was that I didn't go immediately start taking those all magic mushrooms, but I did start going to things like Qigong and to yoga and swimming, to try and get back to the place that I'd found, that kind of place of singularity, of kind of golden connection in the mushrooms. And there's a lot of literature now which talks about psilocybin and ayahuasca and those kind of things as what they call entheogens, which are things which give you a sense of the divine, or a connection to the divine. And actually that's always what they've been taken for. And if you look at how those kind of medicines are used in traditional culture, they are used as giving people a kind of sacrament, a sense of the divine, like the true blood and body of Christ. In fact, there's quite a lot of evidence now that the first disciples kind of the ancient Greeks used a lot of this, but also that the ancient Christians did too, and that was one of the ways that they saw God. So this isn't just me. That wasn't just like my own like midlife fantasy. The entheogen thing is a serious thing, and I think what it allows you to do is to, having reached those pathways once through the mushrooms, I think you can then re-find your way to that place through. I've done now a lot of silent meditation and like 8-day silent yoga and meditation retreats where you go very deeply into your body and you don't speak, and you kind of get to a very kind of still and chilled place. And I can get back to that sense of a kind of connection with the divine, you know, through that kind of thing, or through, you know, daily meditation, or being, you know, in the pond at certain moments. Or I've done quite a lot of breath work, the kind of Wim Hof stuff, or ice baths, or, you know, there are lots of other ways that you can find that state once it's kind of been shown to you, I think.
Wonderful. I mean, you've got your daughters. Did they look at you and go, "You're not the mother"? What, you know, it's quite. I mean, I think when our children start seeing us as a slightly different person, or we start seeing ourselves as a slightly different person. I mean, I learned to read the tarot in COVID, and I love doing it. But I remember my kids were like, "What are you doing?" You know, I was like, "Oh, sorry, you don't know that part of me yet, because I probably haven't revealed it to you. But actually, you know, I have a belief system, and it's hard to describe, and I don't know what the words are, but I'm just going to keep doing the tarot." You know, they were quite kind of like, "Oh, you know, we didn't know our mother in this way." So did people have reactions like that?
Yeah, I think they did. I mean, I think they. I mean, I met, to put it in context, I met my husband on the hippie trail in India. You know, nearly in early 1997, January 1997. We were both in a place called Hampi in Karnataka,
Oh yeah,
in southern India, which is this incredibly holy place full of kind of temples. And so, I mean, I've always had, I think, kind of underneath it, there've always been kind of two parts to me. There was this kind of media executive, and then there was another bit of me, which was, you know, much more of a kind of hippie and a seeker. But I'd never really had very much time to indulge it. So certainly my husband knew that there was that aspect to me, and my children probably, you know, did a bit. But I think that they were slightly taken aback. I was slightly taken aback. I really hadn't expected it. And I was very surprised at myself that I wanted to go to Jamaica and take psilocybin. That was really not something that I had ever really considered or thought about. But suddenly when Decca said she was going, there was just such a strong tug from something really deep inside me going, this, you know, do this thing now, this, you've got to do it. And I also think that as we get older, it's really important to respond to those moments which may lead us on a path to something that we hadn't expected. And that's when I talk about kind of synchronicity. And I love a bit of tarot, or all those kind of stuff, because I think that they open us up to possibilities which are kind of there, which our conscious brains haven't latched onto yet.
Yes.
I went to see, I did all sorts of strange things. I went to see a healer down in Exmoor, and she talked to me about how I was going to create a relationship with a bird that would be really important to me. And so I was surrounded by gongs and this kind of, almost like kind of hanging in a kind of thing in the middle of like 50 different gongs, which she said I'm tuning you up. I'm tuning up your vibration for courage. I remember her doing it and kind of, and thinking at the time, part of me just going, this is completely bonkers. What am I doing? That bit of, the kind of journalistic kind of cynic going, what the hell are you doing here? And then the other bit of me just going, oh, I love this. This is great. I feel amazing. I can, I really can feel the goddesses marching. And I did begin to have a very intense relationship with the heron at the pond, who I kind of saw every day, and began to, and all the different birds there appear in the book as very important manifestations of what Jung calls a psychopomp, which is a kind of messenger from another realm, which shows you something that you need to be paying attention to. So the cormorants, for me,
love that.
Yeah, I love the psychopomp. So the cormorants for me became this kind of these messengers about what was going on in the unconscious. They were the kind of deep dive, what comes up from the depths to kind of ambush us. And it's funny, I was swimming this morning, and one of the ladies was getting really freaked out because there was a cormorant that was diving and she wasn't sure where it was going to surface. And I know that feeling of like, is it going to kind of come up right underneath my stomach? And then the heron for me was about a kind of steadfastness, this capacity to balance, to stand on one leg, to enforce some boundaries, to, you know, separate. I really separated myself off from my mother in quite a way which I probably should have done in my teens and never had. And so to stand on my own 2 feet and to be kind of what I call kind of quite stout and resolute about the boundaries that I needed to erect, what I needed for me. And then the kingfisher, which is on the cover of my book.
Yes, beautiful.
Which is
beautiful.
It's so beautiful, and the kind of that blue flash when a kingfisher comes zooming across, when it comes zooming across my head in the pond, and I see it. It's also that thing of the minutiae of small difference. If you go back somewhere every day, you begin to notice tiny changes, tiny things. So I know where the kingfisher might come because I've seen it so many times, and so if it is there, I see it because I know where it might be. And that just that sense of that kind of whizzing blue and that kind of moment of like total joy and exhilaration. So one of the other really important things I think about this point of life is learning to say yes to joy. And I talk to the women in my circles a lot about the path to their renaissance or their next chapter, or what's going to make them happy, coming from the things that regularly bring them joy. So for me, my happy place is always either in water, you know, definitely somewhere where I can swim, or reading. So actually, Georgette Hare in the bath is about as good as it gets for me. And actually, my kind of renaissance, my new chapter, my noon Queenager bit has been all based on books and water.
That's
so I think wonderful. We know what we need.
I think we do know what we need. And I think sometimes we've just got to, it's complicated, but you've really shared with us how that's worked for you. Then people will get a lot out of that. How do you find what you need and embrace what you need? Thank you so much. Just tell everyone again, name of your book, just they get it, where to find you. Let's get all your...
So I am Eleanor Mills, and my platform is called noon.org.uk. So that's noon as in the middle of the day, because in the 100-year life, 50 is halfway through. And I do a newsletter every Sunday called The Queenager, which became a Substack bestseller, which we've actually now just shifted onto our Noon website. So if you'd like to get my newsletter, which is all about midlife transformation and pivoting and support, that's called The Queenager, and you get it from noon.org.uk. And my book is called Much More to Come, Lessons on the Magnificence and Mayhem of Midlife, lots of M's. It's published by HarperCollins. And if you buy it before the end of August from waterstones.com, you go on their website and you use the code muchmore50 with one capital M, you can get the book for half price.
Fantastic. I encourage everyone to do that. I'm also on Noon. Lots of great people on Noon. So much information. It's really fun, very generous. Thank you so much for being here today. I'm sure everyone will get a lot out of it.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. And follow your joy. Those are the footsteps to happy reincarnation.
Thank you.